Vulnerability is still one of my favorite things to talk about. I love talking about vulnerability. It wasn't always an easy thing for me to do. It still is a struggle. However, it's something that I connect with very well. I think because when we go back to the beginning, when we go back to Genesis and we see the relationship between Adam and Eve, they had this perfect union where they were naked and not ashamed, right? And vulnerability was synonymous of openness and exposure and safety and love and attachment and security, and then sin came, right? And then what was once a peaceful state of being was disrupted, and what was once safety became synonymous of shame and guilt and blame shifting and covering and hiding, and it just completely changed how we viewed each other in relationships. Why I think vulnerability is important is because it takes us back to God's original design for us, which is self accountability and having authority over our own behavior. It takes us to not being accusers, but self regulators and effective communicators. So definitions matter, right? Because if you're in a relationship and you see vulnerability as an opportunity for exposure or threat or attack, then you're most likely to hide and not be vulnerable. But if you're someone who views vulnerability as an opportunity for openness, for love, and for safety, then you're more likely to be vulnerable. Now listen, I want to caution you that vulnerability is something that we often only do when we believe that the other person on the receiving end of us being vulnerable is going to be receptive, is going to be understanding, is going to hear us and validate what we're experiencing. We don't necessarily need anyone to validate us. What happens when they don't? What happens when we don't get the feedback from them that we might want? Well, then we run the risk of shutting down or becoming avoidant or being angry and feeling discouraged or disappointed about the person or about the relationship, when us being vulnerable shouldn't be about the person's response. Then it becomes transactional. And when things become transactional, then it loses its authenticity. When vulnerability is about the other person's response, we inadvertently run the risk of using our emotional state and our language and as a tool to control or manipulate. And we can do that inadvertently. We try to approach a person and be vulnerable, but while we're doing that, we're investigating their responses to see if we're getting from them what we expect to get from them. And if we don't, we often shut down, our walls go up, our defense mechanisms go up, we lash out, or we shut down and become avoidant, when in reality, the opportunity for vulnerability is about you, not the other person. It's about whether or not you're an effective communicator. It will challenge your ability to set appropriate boundaries or communicate them appropriately. It is a sign that you have good communication skills, good conflict resolution skills, that you can articulate your needs in a way that is productive. And a lot of times we struggle because what we think is communicating effectively we're not communicating effectively at all. In fact, the person leaves feeling very confused. And oftentimes they don't have the bandwidth to keep trying to figure out what it is that we're saying. And it may be upsetting to us that they're not getting it. But oftentimes we are the ones who have to take accountability, that the responsibility or the burden of the conversation is on the speaker. When God gave us a command or things that he wants us to follow, he tells us in his word how to treat him. Those who come to him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And he doesn't deviate what he says to make us comfortable. No, he has expectations that if we're going to be in a relationship with him, that we follow his commands. He says, I will know you're my disciple by how you love one another. He doesn't care whether or not you're comfortable with what he's saying. He's telling us that I will measure your love for me by your love for other people, and how what you do to the least of them, you do to me. That's how he teaches us how he wants to be treated. And vulnerability does that. He didn't wait for us to respond or say, how are you going to respond to what I just said? He didn't care. His word is his word, right? And it's up to us whether or not we will obey. So vulnerability is a way for us to effectively communicate to another person what we need and what we desire from them. It also gives us an opportunity to see if the person or the people have the bandwidth to meet us where we are or not. Oh, so I want to give you three. So I want to give you three things that you can, bro, man, from the fifth floor. I want to give you three things to do to help you with vulnerability. Number one, vulnerability is your responsibility. It has nothing to do with the person's response. Number two, make sure that if you're being vulnerable, that you're actually using emotional language, not just being cerebral. Because a lot of times we're communicating to people and we think they understand what we mean. They have no idea when the conversation is done what it is that you need. We don't give people a clear path forward to know what it is that we need and what outcome we're expecting from them. Or it's us that has the issue that needs to be fixed, and we're externalizing it and putting the onus on other people to hear us and validate us as confirmation that what we said is okay. But what happens when we're wrong? What happens when what we're saying doesn't make any sense? Then we have to take personal responsibility for going back to the table and communicating effectively. Number three, take accountability for how you feel. Not everything is the other person's problem. Sometimes how we feel is just how we feel. If you can accept that the person may not respond the way that you want them to, but you're being vulnerable anyway, it will help you to not enter a transactional relationship where the other person validating you or hearing you determines your value and your needs.